Before we can begin project number 2, the one that I'm calling Our House, we have to understand more about creating shapes. I've opened up a new project in After Effects. The first thing I'm going to do is save this file. In our case, you probably won't be keeping this file, but it's a good habit to get into. And in our last project, the one with the vintage TV, we talked a little bit about how to import files. For this lesson, we are not going to be importing media. Instead, we're going to be talking about shapes, which are components that After Effects can create on its own, so you don't need to import anything into this. What I will do is I will start with a composition. I'm going to create a composition by clicking this icon here. Now I've already got a preset with these particular settings. Again, for this project it isn't going to matter. I'm not going to be rendering this project or doing anything further with it other than just learning more about shapes. But I'll name my composition, I'll call it Shapes. So here we have our new composition. This is the blank canvas that we're working with. And a little bit about our workspace here. We have different panels in After Effects. Now, Adobe's website has some excellent information and basic tutorials about how to navigate and use the interface. One thing to notice is that the active panel is going to have a little blue outline. So right now, my composition window is the active one. If I wanted to change settings or do something in a different panel, I would have to click into that panel to activate it. We can also very easily resize all of these windows and panels by grabbing that bar in between them and dragging it. So I have my new composition here. It's called Shapes, and you can tell it's a composition by that little icon. It looks like a frame of film there. So inside of my Shapes composition, I'm going to come down here into my composition window, and I want to create some shapes. The first thing I'll do is create a new layer. So we'll come up here to the Layer menu and say New Shape Layer. And immediately we have a shape layer that's created here in our composition window. And we've automatically changed to a shape drawing tool. And again, this is a very similar setting if you've used Photoshop or Illustrator or some other graphics kind of program. The concept of creating shapes is very, very similar across these different programs. When I click on this shape icon, I get options of different shapes. I'm going to start with a basic rectangle and drawing that out. So you'll notice that it's creating a shape that already has a color, and in this case it has a stroke. The stroke is this blue outline. I could change that very easily. One way to change those settings on this shape is to come up here to this little rectangle that says Fill. I could change this color. It gives us a very comprehensive dialog box here. Click OK. I could also affect this stroke. I could change the color of the stroke. I could change the width of that stroke. I could also take the stroke away entirely. If I press the Option key and then click onto this icon, it will go through the different options of ways that it could fill the stroke, and the little red line across it means no stroke. Again, this is identical to the way, for instance, that Adobe Illustrator deals with shapes. I could do the same with the fill setting. I could press Option and I could go from having a solid fill color to having various gradients to having no fill at all. For this sample that we're doing today, I'll keep it as a fill color just because it's easier to follow what's going on with the shape. But also keep in mind the way that we will be using shapes in the remainder of our course here, where we're using shapes to assist us with making masks. It's irrelevant, really, whether our shapes have a stroke or a fill or a gradient setting. It's really irrelevant to the way that we'll be using it. But I'll keep this rectangle blue colored right now so that we can follow what it's doing. Now if I go down here again to my composition window, I can see that I have this shape layer. And I can see also that as I drew out that rectangle, it created contents of the shape layer. And right now the contents only includes the one rectangle. If I still have my shape tool here and it's still a rectangle. I'm going to set another rectangle here, and you'll notice that we now have two things as contents of this shape layer. That means that whatever I'm doing to this whole shape layer, it's going to affect all of the contents of that layer. For instance, if I grab my select tool here and I move the layer, it's going to move both of those shapes at the same time. If I go to my transform properties and I change the scale, it's going to change all of the contents of that layer. Other transform properties would include rotating or the opacity. That's how transparent it is. One way that I can affect a property, as we've already used a little bit, is to go here and just scroll, pull the mouse back and forth. Another way to do that is to click on that number value and to directly type in the value that you want that setting to be. So I would like to restore this to 0. Press enter, there it goes. So if I come back up here to my shape tool, and we were working with the rectangle tool, we also have a rounded rectangle. Let's pull up the ellipse tool. So an ellipse is just a circular shape, and I'll draw out an ellipse, and you'll notice this is also appearing under contents of my original shape layer. So when these shapes are included as contents underneath one shape layer, I can make universal transformations that affect the entire layer. I can also make changes to the individual shapes that are inside here. Let me go back to my select tool, and here, for instance, when I have the ellipse layer highlighted, it's outlining that one particular shape. I could go in and change settings to that one particular shape, like the fill color, the stroke. I can also now, since I have this layer highlighted here, I see this box outlining it. Using any of these handles, either on the corners or edges of this box, I can make changes to this shape. At the moment it's distorting it in these various directions that I'm pulling it. I could also do that with the corner edges. Let me change some of the settings on my rectangle number 2. I'll change its color to green. And again, I can come over to the edges of the bounding box here. I can distort it, so I'm actually stretching its scale out horizontally or vertically. I could do that also with these corner edges. And you'll notice too, when I come over to a corner edge, I see this little rotation icon, and that gives me the option to rotate that shape. And you'll notice it's only influencing the one shape that I have highlighted. It is not influencing this other rectangle and the ellipse that I have. So even when we have these different shapes contained in one shape layer, we can still control a lot about the individual shapes. Incidentally, this ellipse, this is definitely an oval shape. It's elongated here. It is not a precise circle. One of the ways you could get an exact circle, when you have this ellipse tool selected, if you hold down the Shift key as you draw it out, it will constrain the dimensions so that it will only create a perfect circle shape. The same would be true if I wanted to get a square. I'll highlight the rectangle tool here, and pressing down the Shift key while I draw that out will constrain that to be an exact square shape. That's a couple of ways to manipulate the exact shape that you're drawing out. So I'm going to take off the visibility for this layer here. Notice that everything is still there. I'm just not looking at it right now. If I come up to Layer and select a new shape layer, it's going to give me another layer, and I could continuously draw new shapes. I'm going to change this color here to a bright yellow rectangle. And I just want to demonstrate that if I go up here and grab my select tool, as I'm moving this around, I'm only moving the one shape. Let me turn on this layer that has a bunch of things grouped in together. And as I'm moving that, they're all moving together as a group. So we can have shapes existing in their own shape layer by themselves. We can have multiple shapes grouped together in one layer. I'm going to label these layers right now before it gets confusing. I'm going to call this one yellow rectangle, and I will call this layer here multiple. Now if I've changed my mind about any of these shapes, let's say that I really don't want to see this oval up here, this ellipse number 1. When I have that highlighted here and I press delete, it's gone. And if I have this layer highlighted still, I could still go back and add more shape contents to it. So there I just added rectangle number 4. It happens to be yellow because that was the last color that I was using. I can come up here and change it. Let's make it purple.